Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
So what's it like to be part of the Ted Bundy investigation? Hello, everybody. This is Jared with All Things Crime. I am excited to introduce a new series to you. It's going to be a multi-part or a multi-episode series with Detective Lindsey Wade, who was with the Tacoma Police Department for 21 years. And Detective Wade was part of a cold case unit in Tacoma, and she was able to investigate not only some of the things along with Ted Bundy, but also a number of other cases. And in these episodes that are going to be forthcoming, I'll tell you, a fantastic discussion, and we get into everything from what it's like to sit across from a victim's family to the process that it takes, especially to investigate a cold case. So I hope you enjoy them. And here is episode number 1. Hey, everybody, it's Jared. Welcome to another episode of All Things Crime. I'm super excited this morning to welcome our guest, Lindsey Wade. She was a homicide and sexual assault detective for the Seattle Police Department and lives in the Tacoma area. So she's just an amazing person. I've heard lots about her, and I'm excited to have her on. So, Lindsey, welcome.
Thanks, Jared. I also want to point out real quick, I work for the Tacoma Police Department, not Seattle.
Oh, so, all right. That's
totally
right.
Different agency.
Well, our connection is actually with a good friend of the show and mine, Cloyd Steiger, and he worked for the AG's department and the AG's office up there. And I guess that's where you met.
Yeah. He was my boss in the HITS unit for a few years after I retired from the Tacoma Police Department.
So growing up in Tacoma, what inspired you to become a cop?
Well, a couple things. So I was really fascinated with true crime from an early age. Actually, when I was in high school, I read a book about Ted Bundy, and I think it was the first true crime book that I had ever read, and I was really captivated by the story, captivated and terrified at the same time. And I think it really hit home for me, especially given the fact that there were so many commonalities, and a lot of these horrendous crimes that he committed occurred in Washington, and he grew up in Tacoma, and so there were a lot of things that struck me about the book. And it was just, I think after reading that book, I just had kind of decided I wanted to be a detective. There was that, and then there were a couple of other things that sort of happened when I was a kid. There was the 2 cases actually that occurred when I was a little girl in Tacoma that kind of stuck with me, and 2 little girls that were abducted and murdered back in 1986. And the cases just were kind of like urban legends in our area. They'd been pretty high profile cases but were unsolved, and so it was kind of like the boogeyman effect. They were cases that really scared the hell out of everybody, including little kids like myself, and kind of made us think twice about riding our bikes, and didn't want to play in the woods, and just kind of changed the atmosphere and changed our outlook on, oh my gosh, there's actually bad people in the world. It was sort of that first experience realizing there are really bad people out there. So that kind of stuck with me throughout my life, really, and into my adulthood. And I never really dreamed that I would be involved in investigating either one of those cases as a police officer, but as it turned out, that's exactly what happened. And also got to be involved in doing some work on Ted Bundy as well. So it all kind of came full circle for me as a detective many years later.
Wow, that is so cool, and we'll definitely get into some of the details of that. But so growing up there, I mean, that's a beautiful area. You wouldn't think that there'd be a ton of crime there.
It is very beautiful, but yeah, there's a very high crime rate in Tacoma, violent crime in particular. And I've heard people ponder, what is it about the Pacific Northwest and what is it about this area? I don't know. I mean, I've heard all kinds of wild theories thrown out about, why is there such a high rate of violent crime? And I don't know.
It just attracts the nutballs, huh?
Who knows? Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it's the weather. I don't know.
Yeah. People go crazy because it's always cloudy up there. But from about June to September is one of the most gorgeous areas to be in. Oh my gosh. I've attended a number of conferences and things up there, and it is just absolutely, you can't beat it. I mean, with all the pine trees and the mountains and, absolutely gorgeous. So yeah. I envy you for at least 2 or 3 months out of the year, but
yeah,
it is interesting though, especially with like the Ted Bundy case. When you have real psychotic type serial killings that seem to garner the most attention, I think everybody understands those are basically the so rare but they gather the most attention. So I think everybody thinks they're a lot more common than what they are.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of serial killers out there, and that the common citizens never heard of. I mean, because it sadly is not as uncommon as you might think, but most of them don't garner the attention that somebody like Bundy or Dahmer, what we call the big five, right? Like the ones that everybody knows about, there's been a gazillion books and TV shows made about. But there are a lot of others that have kind of flown under the radar and thankfully haven't gotten as much attention.
Right. Well, what is the police definition of a serial killer?
Well, I think the FBI's definition is like 3 or more murders with a cooling off period in between. I think that was the last definition I heard. So
not necessarily just killing like one family. That wouldn't necessarily qualify them as a serial killer. There has to be space in between the victims.
Right. Yeah. If you slaughter a family or kill a bunch of people at one time, it's called a mass killing.
Okay. Well, which one do you want to explore first, Ted Bundy or the little girls that went missing?
Your choice.
Okay. Well, let's start with Ted Bundy then. I mean, obviously he's the most famous. So, first of all, how close were you growing up to what happened with Ted Bundy up there?
Well, so I grew up in the city of Tacoma, and then also in University Place, which is a suburb of Tacoma. He, of course, was long gone. I mean, he was executed in 89. I mean, so I was, gosh, I have to think about that. I think I was in junior high when he was executed. So obviously he was long gone from this area by that time. But some interesting parallels. So he grew up in the north end of Tacoma, not all that far from where I grew up. His mother worked at the University of Puget Sound, which is a private college in Tacoma. My mom actually attended that same college and actually knew his mom from The Office at UPS. So Tacoma, even though it's, I think the population is around 200,000 people, maybe a little more. It has a very small town feel. Like it's really hard to meet somebody and not figure out that you have some common acquaintances. It's that kind of place. So as far as his crimes that were known, most of those occurred in Seattle and King County, at least in, for the Washington state crimes. So he doesn't have any known or confirmed victims in Tacoma, although the Anne Marie Burr case from 1961 is, thought by many to be, possibly his first victim. And he would have been 14 at the time, was never a suspect in that case when the crime was originally investigated. But later, once he was identified as being this prolific cross-country serial killer, he certainly was looked at as a potential suspect with relation to her case. And so that's kind of how I got involved with the case. Around 2010, 2011, my partner and I were looking at Anne Marie Burr case, it was the oldest cold case in our library of about 250 cold cases that we had in Tacoma at the time. And her case is a missing person case. And for those not familiar, August 31st, 1961, she was abducted right out of her house in the north end of Tacoma, a couple blocks from the University of Puget Sound. And she was 8. She lived with her parents and her siblings. And literally in the middle of the night, somebody came into the house and without anyone noticing or hearing anything, took her right out of the house. Early in the morning, her parents were alerted to the fact that she was gone, and her mom got up and looked around the house, saw the front door standing open, saw a window in the living room ajar, and immediately recognized that something was terribly wrong. So it was a huge investigation, probably one of the largest manhunts in Tacoma Police Department history. They had the National Guard out searching, detectives going door to door. They interviewed, I'm sure, hundreds of people. It was actually a very, very good investigation that was conducted. However, there was never any sign of her found, no trace of her found anywhere. And to this day, she's still a missing person. So, Ted Bundy was never looked at or never investigated for that case. Of course, he was a 14-year-old boy at that time, and there would have been no reason for his name to come up. There are rumors, that I've heard over the years that, he was her paper boy and, they knew each other, and none of that's true. So he didn't live in her neighborhood. He lived across town. So there was really no connection. I mean, he did live in Tacoma. That's the only connection, really. So he, as I said, he wasn't looked at during the initial investigation, but years later, there was some speculation that potentially he could be involved. He always denied any involvement. Anne's mother even wrote him letters in prison asking him about it. And, he steadfastly denied that he had any involvement in her disappearance. He actually wrote a letter back to Mrs. Burr from prison and, just absolutely denied that he had anything to do with her murder or her abduction. So there was really no evidence to link him to the case, and there was no evidence to link anyone else to the case either. So fast forward to 2011, Gene Miller, who was the cold case detective at the time, and myself were looking at Anne Marie's case, and we were talking about evidence that had been collected back in 1961 that had never been sent to the crime lab. And of course, what they could have done with something in 1961 is quite different than what you could do with something today. So we, went out to the crime, or actually to our property room, and pulled all the original evidence that was collected, went through it, and learned that there were a couple of things that were collected that seemed like they could have potential DNA on them. And while we were working on that piece, I was thinking, okay, well, we know that there are a couple named suspects in this case. If, we luck out and we have some DNA on any of this evidence, are we going to have anyone to compare it to? And so that's when I first started asking this question I wonder, is Ted Bundy even in CODIS? I mean, he got executed in 1989, well before CODIS, well before the DNA databases were created in the States, is he even in there? So that kind of set me off on this wild goose chase, going down rabbit hole after rabbit hole in Washington and then in Florida, trying to track down a sample of his DNA, which took a significant amount of time. And basically what I learned was no. The answer is no. His DNA is not in CODIS. It doesn't exist anywhere. And I finally reached out to an administrator, a CODIS administrator in Florida, because I knew he was executed in Florida, and spoke with him about it. And he said, yeah, I get a couple calls a year from detectives around the country asking me the same question, do you have Ted Bundy's DNA? And the answer is no, we don't. And so I said, okay, well, we've got this case that we're working on. And aside from that, we're talking about Ted Bundy here. Like, he is one of the most prolific serial killers in our country. He went from state to state. I'm sure he's committed all kinds of crimes we don't even know about. He's the poster child for CODIS. So he needs to be in there. So we kind of put our heads together and, started brainstorming. How are we we got to find this DNA somewhere. So then it became sort of like, the Ted Bundy DNA scavenger hunt. And he came up with a couple ideas of what he was going to do and places he was going to check. And I decided, okay, I remember reading in Ann Rule's book that she got letters from Ted Bundy when he was in jail. And maybe she still has the letters, and maybe his DNA is on those stamps that he sent. And of course, this is just a total long shot and kind of a wild goose chase, but I'm like, I really have nothing to lose by finding out. So meanwhile, while I'm looking into that piece, David Kaufman down in Florida started looking into samples that they had at the crime lab in Florida, and they ended up finding some wax molds of his teeth that were taken for the Chi Omega case, because there were bite marks on one of the victims. So they still had the wax molds, and so they attempted to get DNA from the wax molds from his teeth, and there wasn't enough DNA there to generate a profile, so that kind of went nowhere. I was able to get in touch with Ann Rule, who was still living up here in Washington State at the time, and she did still have letters from Ted, and she agreed to provide those to me. I did some research with the prison down in Florida to find out, hey, do inmates, or like at that time, because I think these letters were mailed in '86, did inmates at that time have to, did they put their own stamps on their mail? Who did it? Was there a mail room? This is old school stamps. This is before they had the self-adhesive stamps. These were the roll off and lick stamps. So they confirmed that, yeah, inmates back at that time had to basically put their own stamps on their mail. Nobody did it in the mail room or anything like that. So I was feeling pretty confident that, okay, if there is DNA on these stamps, it's going to be Bundy's DNA. So I got a hold of our crime lab, talked to our DNA supervisor, and asked about submitting these envelopes with the stamps in the hopes of getting at least a reference sample for Bundy. I knew that, those wouldn't be eligible to go into CODIS, but I was thinking, well, at least it's a start to go somewhere. And then before we even had these envelopes tested, I get a call from David Kaufman, who's the CODIS administrator down in Florida, letting me know that he actually hit the mother lode and tracked down an old crusty blood vial of Ted Bundy's blood that was collected in 1978. And it was in a safe in I think it was the Columbia County Clerk's office in Florida. And this blood had been collected in 1978 at the time of his arrest. And the blood was completely putrefied. It was not usable. However, the lid of the Vacutainer had some dried blood, and they were able to flake off a few pieces of the dried blood, and it was usable. And they generated a complete, in his words, beautiful profile from this crusty blood vial. And so they actually were able to enter that profile into the Florida DNA database, which was fantastic, but it was not going to go into the national DNA database because of CODIS rules. So on one hand, I was super excited that, hey, you found it, it's going in, but wait, stop. No, what do you mean it's not going to go into national? Like, again, he was committing crimes all over the country. It's great that it's in Florida, but we know he committed crimes in other states besides Florida. So because he was not a convicted offender at the time his DNA was collected in Florida, he didn't qualify. And because he was no longer in custody in Florida, his DNA didn't qualify to go into the national database based on the CODIS rules. So I was like, okay, well, I'm not okay with that. we've got to talk to somebody. And so he ended up meeting with the CODIS administrators for Endis and the FBI, and getting an approval to get Ted Bundy's DNA put into the national DNA database under the legal index. So he actually is not in the offender index, he's in the legal, but that's just semantics. It doesn't really matter at this point because his DNA is still searching against crime scene evidence that comes up into the national database from all the other states.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.